Good morning, philosophers. We are back in the studio, recovering from the trip with the rain and drama. All right, let's get back into it. So we're going to continue on through the introduction. I really like this this translation of the book because of this introduction in large part. It's really good stuff. So this next section of the introduction is on it's called the philosophical background, but it's going to give like a flyover view of Stoicism, which is, this book should probably be considered one of the most important reads for studying Stoicism. So let's continue on with the introduction. The composition of the Meditations is normally dated to the 170s, Marcus's last decade. That this was a dark and stressful period for him can hardly be doubted. In the 10 years between 169 and 179, he had to cope with constant fighting on the frontier, the abortive revolt of Cassius, and the deaths of his colleague Verus, his wife Faustina, and others. Though he could hardly have anticipated the century of turmoil that would follow his death, he may have suspected that his son and successor, Commodus, was not the man he had hoped. That in these circumstances Marcus should have sought consolation in philosophy is only natural, but understanding what Marcus looked for from his philosophical studies requires a certain amount of orientation. To understand the Meditations in context, we must familiarize ourselves not only with Stoicism, the philosophical system that underlies the work, but also with the role of philosophy in ancient life more generally. Today, philosophy is an academic discipline, one that few people other than professional philosophers would consider central to their everyday existence. While we may think of ourselves as having a philosophy of life, it bears little relation to what goes on in the philosophy departments of our universities. The careers of 20th century analytic philosophy often seem remote from what the American philosopher Thomas Nagel terms mortal questions. The problems involved in making ethical choices, constructing a just society, responding to suffering and loss, and coming to terms with the prospect of death. Indeed, most of us would be inclined to see these issues as the province of religion rather than philosophy. For Marcus and his contemporaries, the situation was very different. Ancient philosophy certainly had its academic side. Athens and other large cities had publicly financed chairs of philosophy, and professional philosophers taught, argued, and wrote as they do today. But philosophy also had a more practical dimension. It was not merely a subject to write or argue about, but one that was expected to provide a design for living, a set of rules to live one's life by. This was a need not met by ancient religion, which privileged ritual over doctrine and provided little in the way of moral and ethical guidelines. Nor did anyone expect it to. That was what philosophy was for. Philosophy in the modern sense is largely the creation of one man, the 5th century BC Athenian thinker Socrates. But it is primarily in the Hellenistic period that we see the rise of philosophical sects, promulgating coherent belief systems that an individual could accept as a whole, and which were designed to explain the world in its totality. Of these Hellenistic systems, the most important, both for Romans in general and for Marcus in particular, was the Stoic school. The movement takes its name from the Stoa, porch or portico, in downtown Athens, where its founder Zeno, in 332 BC, taught and lectured. Zeno's doctrines were reformulated and developed by his successors, Cleanthes in 331 and Chrysippus in 280 BC. Chrysippus in particular was a voluminous writer, and it was he who laid the foundations for systematic Stoicism. This early academic Stoicism is the source of certain key terms and concepts that reappear frequently in the Meditations, and proper understanding of Marcus's approach requires some familiarity with the system as a whole. Stoicism. Of the doctrines central to the Stoic worldview, perhaps the most important is the unwavering conviction that the world is organized in a rational and coherent way. More specifically, it is controlled and directed by an all-pervading force that the Stoics designated by the term logos, the term from which English logic and the suffix logi derive. The term has a semantic range so broad as to be almost untranslatable. At a basic level, it designates rational, connected thought, whether envisioned as a characteristic, rationality, the ability to reason, or as the product of that characteristic, an intelligible utterance or a connected discourse. Logos operates both in individuals and in the universe as a whole. In individuals, it is the faculty of reason. On a cosmic level, it is the rational principle that governs the organization of the universe. In this sense, it is synonymous with nature, providence, or God. When the author of John's Gospel tells us that the Word, Logos, was with God and is to be identified with God, he is borrowing Stoic terminology. All events are determined by the Logos and follow in an unbreakable chain of cause and effect. Stoicism is thus from the outset a deterministic system that appears to leave no room for human free will or moral responsibility. In reality, the Stoics were reluctant to accept such an arrangement and attempted to get around the difficulty by defining free will as a voluntary accommodation to what is in any case inevitable. According to this theory, man is like a dog tied to a moving wagon. If the dog refuses to run along with the wagon, he will be dragged by it, yet the choice remains his to run or to be dragged. In the same way, humans are responsible for their choices and actions, even though these have been anticipated by the Logos and form part of its plan. Even actions which appear to be, and indeed are, immoral or unjust advance the overall design, which taken as a whole is harmonious and good. They too are governed by the Logos. I don't like the they take it too far with the Logos. Like it makes sense to think of the universe, the consistency of the universe, the rational consistency of the universe as Logos, because that's the foundation of all of our logic. It all begins with A equals A, which is a description of the consistency of the universe. But they definitely take it too far in talking about it like this, I think. There's some children fighting happening downstairs. I'm a little distracted. One moment. I don't think the kids got enough sleep last night. They're having trouble today. But the Logos is not simply an impersonal power that governs and directs the world. It is also an actual substance that pervades the world, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a form as concrete as oxygen or carbon. In its physical embodiment, the Logos exists as pneuma, a substance imagined by the earliest Stoics as pure fire, and by Chrysippus as a mixture of fire and air. Pneuma is the power, the vital breath, that animates animals and humans. It is, in Dylan Thomas's phrase, quote, the force that, through the green fuse, drives the flower. And it is present in lifeless materials like stone or metal as the energy that holds the object together. The internal tension that makes a stone a stone. All objects are thus a compound of lifeless substance and vital force. When Marcus refers, as he does on a number of occasions, to cause and material, he means the two elements of these compounds, inert substance and animating pneuma. That's spelled P-N-E-U-M-A. Which are united so long as the object itself exists. When the object perishes, the pneuma that animated it is reabsorbed into the Logos as a whole. This is kind of very superstitious. This process of destruction and reintegration happens to individual objects at every moment. It also happens on a larger scale to the entire universe, which at vast intervals is entirely consumed by fire, a process known as ekpyrosis, and then regenerated. If the world is indeed orderly, if the Logos controls all things, then the order it produces should be discernible in all aspects of it. That supposition not only led the Stoics to speculate about the nature of the physical world, but also motivated them to seek the rationality characteristic of the Logos in other areas, notably in formal logic and the nature and structure of language. Their interest in etymology is reflected in several entries in the Meditations. This systematizing impulse reappears in many other fields as well. The catalogue of Chrysippus' own words, preserved by the late 3rd century biographer Diogenes Laertius, is very long indeed. It includes not only philosophical treatises in a narrow sense, but also works such as On How to Read Poetry and Against the Touching Up of Paintings. Later Stoics would try their hands at history and anthropology, as well as more conventionally philosophical topics. The expansion of Stoic thought was not only intellectual but also geographical. The movement had been born in Athens. The century and a half that followed Chrysippus' death, it spread to other centers, in particular to Rome. The Romans of the 2nd century BC were in the midst of a course of conquest that by the end of the century would leave them the effective masters of the Mediterranean. With conquest came culture. Looking back on the rapid Hellenization of the Roman aristocracy between 200 BC and his own day, the poet Horace famously observed that conquered Greece was the true conqueror. Nowhere is the influence of Greece more obvious than in philosophy. Greek philosophers, including the Stoics, Panaetius in 185 BC and Posidonius in 135 BC, visited Rome to lecture. Many spent extended periods there. In the 1st century BC, it became the fashion for young upper-class Romans to study in Athens, in an ancient version of the 18th century Grand Tour. Roman aristocrats acted as patrons to individual philosophers and assembled large libraries of philosophical texts, like that at the famous villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum. And Romans like Cicero and Lucretius attempted to expound Greek philosophical doctrines in Latin. I think my office is slowly turning into a villa of the Papyri. Of the major philosophical schools, it was Stoicism that had the greatest appeal. Unlike some other sects, the Stoics had always approved of participation in public life. And this stand struck a chord with the Roman aristocracy, whose code of values placed a premium on political and military activity. Stoicism had even been described, not altogether unfairly, as the real religion of upper-class Romans. In the process, it became a rather different version of the philosophy from that taught by Zeno and Chrysippus. Perhaps the most important development was a shift in emphasis, a narrowing of focus. Early and middle Stoicism was a holistic system. It aimed to embrace all knowledge, and its focus was speculative and theoretical. Roman Stoicism, by contrast, was a practical discipline, not an abstract system of thought, but an attitude to life. Partly for historical reasons, it is this Romanized Stoicism that has most influenced later generations. Indeed, the application of the adjective stoic to a person who shows strength and courage in misfortune probably owes more to the aristocratic Roman value system than it does to Greek philosophers. Need some more coffee. Getting a late start today because I was up really late camping. Stoicism in its later form was a system inspired as much by individuals as by texts or doctrines. One of its most distinguished adherents was Marcus Cato, known as Cato the Younger, to distinguish him from his great-grandfather, prominent a century earlier. A senator of renowned rectitude when Julius Caesar marched on Rome in 49 BC, Cato sided with Caesar's rival Pompey in defense of the legitimate government. When it was clear that Caesar would triumph, Cato chose not to survive the Republic, killing himself after the Battle of Munda in 46. Within a century, he had become an emblem of Stoic resistance to tyranny. Under Nero, he was immortalized by the poet Lucan, I don't know, and praised in a laudatory biography by the senator Thrasea Paetus, whose own resistance to Nero cost him his life. Thrasea's son-in-law, Helvidius Priscus, played a similar role and came to a similar end under Vespasian. These long history diatribes lose my attention quickly. Cato, Thrasea, and Helvidius were doers, not writers, and their legendary heroicism inevitably lends them a somewhat two-dimensional quality. A more complex and much more interesting figure was the poet Lucian's uncle, Lucius Annaeus Seneca. Yeah, Seneca. Commonly known as Seneca the Younger, to distinguish him from his equally distinguished father. Originally counselor to the young Nero, he was eventually forced to commit suicide after being implicated in an attempted coup against his erstwhile pupil. Men's lives are not always consistent with their ideals, and some critics have found it hard to reconcile Seneca's fabulous wealth and his shameless flattery of Nero with his philosophical views. Yet his works, in particular the letters to Lucilius, remain the most engaging and accessible expressions of later Stoicism. Because they were written in Latin, they were also among the most influential on succeeding generations. But not all Stoics were wealthy senators. There was another kind of Stoic exemplar as well. The outsider whose ascetic lifestyle won him the admiration of his wealthier contemporaries and enabled him to criticize the pretenses of upper-class society with real authority. An example of the type is Gaius Musonius Rufus, in the year 300 to 100. A member of the Roman administrative class, the so-called Knights Equites, who was banished by both Nero and Vespasian. A still more dramatic example was Musonius's student Epictetus, 55 to 135, who had taken up the practice of philosophy as a slave. Totally have his. I have his works, and we will probably read them in the future. Who had taken up the practice of philosophy as a slave and devoted the remainder of his life to it after being freed. He had been exiled to Nicopolis in northern Greece under Domitian after the tyrant's death, elected to remain there where he taught and lectured to visitors who often traveled great distances to study with him. One of these was the upper-class historian and statesman Arrian, in year 86 to 160, who published an extensive record of the master's discussions, a text conventionally referred to as the Discourses of Epictetus, that I have sitting on my desk in front of me right now, actually. He later produced an abridged version. It's just wild to think about. I have these books in front of me, and they were authored in, the year 100, 100, 2,000 years ago. It's crazy. It's crazy that I still have them in front of me. Okay, so who published an extensive record of the master's discussions, a text conventionally referred to as the Discourses of Epictetus. He later produced an abridged version. Epictetus seems to have been an especially important figure for Marcus. He thanks his philosophical mentor Rusticus for introducing him to Epictetus's lectures, either the discourses themselves or a private set of lecture notes. And a series of quotations and paraphrases from the philosopher appear in Book 11 of the Meditations. And Arrian's abridged Enchiridion provides the closest literary parallel to the Meditations itself, not only in its content, but also its form, a series of relatively short and unrelated entries. Okay, the next one is a few pages on Stoicism as it relates to the Meditations. We will get to that next time. I hope you guys are enjoying this. It's a lot of introduction before the actual meat, but I think it's good and important for me to remember. That's why I'm reading it. So I've noticed a lot lately that my phone has been owning me. Sorry, I hit the mic. My phone has been owning me, not the other way around. My phone has been prompting me to action instead of me using my phone to prompt it to action. And every so often I have to do this. It seems like once a year. I have to reevaluate my phone's place in my life. And a while back, I reevaluated social media's place in my life, and it has been like, I'm thinking like maybe 2 months ago, I kind of reevaluated social media after I had an interview with Hotep Jesus on Anarchast. Started, opening my perception to how social media is actually affecting the world and people in general. And I won't turn this into a dissertation on that because I think I've done it on my shows several times now. But the short version is that social medias are able to control society and literally direct culture by controlling what everyone's looking at. What everyone's looking at is the same thing as culture. And through their algorithms and through their control of the news feed and what you see, they're able to control what people look at. So directly control culture, which I think is maybe one of the biggest threats to our society out right now. So pulling myself out of that laboratory where they get to experiment on me and my perceptions of the world every day. It started by Facebook banning me, like coming up on a year ago now. It's been a while. And that, I think, has been one of the greatest things that's ever happened to me. Anyway, this is turning into a diatribe. This is not the point. Anyway, the point was taking control back over my social media instead of it being the boss, making me the boss, began a couple months ago, and it has had amazing effects on my life. Amazing. And so today I'm going to be focusing quite literally on my phone. Recently I removed all social media apps from my phone. So no more Twitter, no more anything on my phone. Because that is probably the primary way that my phone controls my thoughts throughout the day. And by control my thoughts, I don't mean like mind control. I mean, the more I take control of my habits and life and my focus throughout the day, that's what it is. Focus. When we do these philosophical think times, it's about quiet, introspective focus, future planning, setting our future expectations, making plans for the things that we think are going to go bad or sideways so that we can be prepared, so that we can approach them, with more tranquility. The phone device is the antithesis. It is the arch enemy of what I'm trying to do with my life in terms of taking control of my focus, being focused, being tranquil, being in charge of my life. The phone as a device is primarily nothing more than a distraction, a constant distraction, a ding, a needle that pops the balloon of focus. Like no matter what you're doing, you hear your phone vibrate or you hear your phone's notification sound. Even if you don't pick up the device and look at the notification, which I think most of us are sort of trained to do. It trains us to just, that vibrated. Let me pick it up and see what it is in case it's something important. It's never important. It is almost never important. It's never, at least I can say this, it is almost never important enough to pop the bubble of your focus in life. And so I've uninstalled social medias from my phone. The social medias that I have not yet been banned from are going to be used by me at times of the day from my computer when I need to use them or when I choose to use them. I will be in charge of social medias at the times of day in which social media will interact with me, not the other way around anymore. And for that matter, and this is what I'm going to be working on today, every single time I get a notification on my phone, I'm going to evaluate whether that notification, the source of that notification was worth its encroachment into my lifespan. Like, this day belongs to me. I will choose, where my focus goes, and nothing else will. And anything that deigns itself worthy of encroaching onto my day's focus is going to be evaluated for its existence in my life. And so anyway, that's a fancy way of just saying, here's my plan. So anytime I get a notification today from any source, be it an instant messenger of some kind, Telegram, Signal, text message, email, any of that stuff, I'm going to make a decision to turn off notifications maybe to that chat group. Like I'm in a ton of Telegram groups, and most of them I don't really need, immediate updates on. So most of those are going to get their notifications turned off, and I will check them when I want to check them. I think the close family and friends, obviously, they'll probably get their notifications left on. But I'm going to really be trying to reduce the noise, the disruptive noise from my device today. Anyway, so that's what I'm going to be thinking about, and that's what I'm working on. Guys, have a great day. Have a great day. Make it your day. Own the day. Don't let anybody mess with your day. Take it easy.